Greetings. I've been delayed a few days because I fell under the weather lately, but I'm okay now. So the last time we did the journey of the kings to Bethlehem, now we're doing the genealogy of the kings and their meeting with Herod the Great. Subtext: Genealogy of the Kings. I heard that the three kings traced their genealogy back to Job, who had dwelt on the Caucasus and had jurisdiction over districts far and wide. Long before Balaam and before Abraham's sojourn in Egypt, they had the prophecy of the star and hope of its fulfillment. The leaders of a race from the land of Job had, upon an expedition to Egypt in the region of Heliopolis, received from an angel the revelation that a virgin, the Savior, would be born, whom their descendants would honor. They were also instructed to go no farther, but to return to their homes and watch the stars. They celebrated festivals in memory of the event, erected altars and triumphal arches, which they adorned with flowers, and then turned back home. There may, perhaps, have been 3,000 of these people collected together at this time. They were dwellers in Media and star worshippers of a beautiful yellowish-brown color and of tall and noble stature. They roamed from place to place with their herds, ruling wherever they pleased by their irresistible power. They had, as the kings now related, been the first to announce the prophecy to their people, and the first to introduce among them the observation of the stars. When both the prophecy and the study had fallen into general oblivion, they were received first by one of Balaam's scholars, and long after him by three prophetesses, the daughters of the three kings' forefathers. And now at last, 500 years since the time of those prophetesses, the star had appeared which they were to follow. Those three prophetesses were contemporary. They were deeply versed in the stars. They had visions in the spirit of prophecy. They foresaw that a star would arise out of Jacob and that an inviolate virgin would bring forth the Savior. Clothed in long garments, they went about the country announcing this prophecy, exhorting to good, foretelling the future down to the most remote ages, and promising that messengers from the Savior would come to their people and lead them to the worship of the true God. The fathers of these virgins built a temple to the promised Mother of God on the spot where their lands joined, and in its vicinity a tower from which to observe the constellations and their various changes. From these three princes, about 500 years after, and through a lineal descent of 15 generations, sprang the holy kings. It was by their intermingling with the other races that they became so different in color. For a length of time, some of their ancestors were constantly on the tower observing the stars. What they saw was noted down and taught orally, and in consequence of these observations, many changes gradually crept into their temple and worship. All periods remarkable on account of their reference to the coming of the Messiah were pointed out to them by visions in the stars. During the last years since Mary's conception, these visions were more and more significant, and the coming of salvation more explicitly shown. At the time of the Blessed Virgin's conception, they saw the Virgin with the scepter and the scales, in whose evenly balanced plates lay wheat and grapes. They saw, too, a prefiguration of the bitter passion itself, for they beheld the newborn king involved in a war from which he came out victorious over all his enemies. This observing of the stars was accompanied by religious ceremonies, fasting, prayer, purification, and self-denial. They watched not one star alone, but a whole constellation. By certain coincidences among the different stars as they gazed were formed the visions and pictures that they saw. The wicked engaging in this star worship were affected by evil influences and thrown into convulsions by their demoniacal visions. It was by the agency of such people that the practice arose of sacrificing the aged and little children. But such cruelties gradually fell into disuse. The king saw the visions clearly, and from them tasted sweet, interior consolation, without feeling the effects of any malign influence. They became, on the contrary, better and more pious. With great simplicity and candor, they described what they saw to their inquisitive auditors. But when they perceived that what their forefathers had so patiently awaited for 2,000 years was not received with implicit belief, they became sad. The star was hidden by a cloud, but when it again appeared, looking so large among the drifting clouds and so near to the earth, the kings arose from their couches, called the people of the city together, and pointed it out to them. The people gazed awestruck. Some were deeply impressed, others were vexed at the kings for disturbing their rest, while the majority sought to but profit by the princely bounty. I heard the royal travelers saying how far they had journeyed up to this time. They reckoned the day's journey on foot as one of 12 hours. Before reaching their place of meeting, one had made a journey of 3 such days, the other 5 of 12 hours. But on their beasts, which were dromedaries, subtracting the night and the hours of rest, they could treble that distance. Therefore, the 3 days' journey on foot up to the place of meeting were equivalent to only 1, and the 5 days counted but for 2. From that place to where they were at present, they had made a 56 days' journey of 12 hours, or 672 hours. They had, therefore, from Christ's birth up to the present, counting the days that passed until they met, and those devoted to resting, consumed about 25 days. At this place also they took a day to rest. The people here were singularly importunate and shameless. They pressed around the kings like swarms of wasps. The royal travelers dealt out to them freely small triangular yellow pieces like tin, and also darker grains. They must have possessed unnumbered treasures. When the caravan was departing, it wound around the city, in which I saw idols standing in the temple. On the opposite side they crossed a bridge, and went through a little Jewish place that contained a synagogue. And now they were on a good road, hastening toward the Jordan. About 100 persons had joined their caravan. They had still a journey of about 24 hours to Jerusalem, but I saw them passing through no more cities, and they were met but by few people, as it was the Sabbath. The nearer they drew to Jerusalem, the more disheartened they became, for the star no longer shone with its usual brightness, and, since their entrance into Judea, they saw it but seldom. They had hoped also to find the people on their route exulting with joy and celebrating with magnificence the birth of the newborn Savior, to honor whom they themselves had come so far. But, beholding no sign of excitement, they grew anxious and perplexed, thinking that, perhaps, after all, they had made a mistake. It had been midday when they crossed the Jordan. They paid the ferryman, though only 2 of them lent a helping hand. They held back and let them attend to their transportation themselves. The Jordan was not broad at that time, and it was full of sandbanks. Boards were laid over crossbeams, and the dromedaries stood upon them. The passage across the river was made expeditiously. The kings first appeared to be going toward Bethlehem, but soon they turned and went on to Jerusalem. I saw the city towering high up against the sky. The Sabbath was over before the caravan arrived outside the city. Subtext: the kings before Herod. The caravan of the kings took about a quarter of an hour to pass any given point. When it halted before Jerusalem, the star had become invisible. Consequently, the travelers were very much troubled. The kings rode upon dromedaries, and 3 other dromedaries were laden with the baggage. The rest of the cavalcade were mounted upon nimble animals of a yellowish color with small heads. I know not whether they were horses or asses, but they were very different in appearance from our horses. The animals upon which the nobles rode were very handsomely caparisoned and hung with golden stars and little chains. Some of the followers went to the gate of the city and returned with officers and soldiers. The arrival of the kings at that time, when no feast was being celebrated, when no special commercial interest seemed to bring them, and also by that particular road, was something remarkable. They explained to the officials why they had come and spoke of the star and the child, but the hearers were ignorant on the subject, and so the kings began again to think that they had surely erred, since they could not find one person who looked as if he knew anything connected with the redemption of the world. The people gazed at them in wonder, unable to conceive what they wanted. The kings explained that they were ready to pay for whatever they got from them, and that they wished to confer with their king. And now arose great hurrying to and fro, the travelers meanwhile interchanging questions and answers with the crowds gathered around them. Some had indeed heard of a child that was to be born at Bethlehem, but they were poor, ignorant people, and their words had no weight. Others laughed derisively, and the kings grew troubled and disheartened. And then they perceived by the expressions of the people that Herod knew nothing of what they sought, and that he was by no means beloved by his subjects. They became anxious as to how they should address him. They had recourse to prayer, their courage revived, and they said to one another, "He who has brought us so quickly here by means of the star will also lead us home in safety." They now led the caravan around the city and brought it in at the side nearer Mount Calvary. Not far from the fish market, they and their animals were conducted into a circular court, which was surrounded by halls and dwellings, and before whose gate guards were standing. In the middle of the court was a well at which they watered the beasts, and all found quarters in the stalls and places under the arches. On one side of the court arose the mountains on which it lay. On the other, it was free and shaded by trees. I saw people coming with torches and examining the baggage. Herod's palace stood higher up the mountain not far from this court. I saw the road leading to it lighted up by torches and lanterns hung on poles. I saw officials going down from the palace and conducting thither Theophano, the eldest of the kings. He was received under an archway and ushered into a hall. There he made known his errand to a courtier, who reported it to Herod. Herod became almost insane at the news and gave orders for the kings to present themselves before him on the following morning. He also sent word to them to rest while he made inquiries, and he would inform them the result. When Theophano returned, he and his 2 royal companions became still more uneasy and ordered the baggage that had been unpacked to be packed again. They slept none that night. I saw some of them going around the city with guides. It seemed to me that they suspected Herod of knowing all, but of being unwilling to disclose the truth to them. They still sought the star. In Jerusalem itself all was quiet, but there was much running to and fro and questioning among the sentinels of the court. It must have been about 11 o'clock at night when Theophano was sent for by Herod. There appeared to be some kind of festivity going on, for the palace was ablaze with lights, and I saw females in it. The news brought by Theophano threw Herod into the greatest terror. He dispatched servants to the temple and also into the city, and I saw the priests and scribes and aged Jews going to him with rolls of writings under their arms. They wore their priestly garments, also their breastplates, and their girdles on which letters were inscribed. There were about 20 around him expounding the writings. I saw them also mounting with him to the roof of the palace and gazing at the stars. Herod was very uneasy and perplexed, but the scribes tried to divert him by endeavoring to prove that there was nothing in the talk of the kings, that those Eastern people were always superstitiously raving about the stars, and that if there was any truth in what they said, surely the priests of the temple and the dwellers in the holy city would have known it long ago. Next morning at daybreak, I saw one of the courtiers going down to the caravan and bringing up all 3 of the kings to Herod's palace. They were ushered into an apartment around which were pots of foliage and bushes. Refreshments were spread at the entrance. But the kings declined the proffered food and remained standing until Herod entered. They approached him with an obeisance and without preamble put to him the question as to where they should find the newborn king of the Jews, for they had seen his star and they were come to do him homage. Herod was very much troubled, but he concealed his fears. Some of the scribes were still with him. He questioned the kings closely concerning the star and told them that of Bethlehem Ephratah ran the promise. But Menzer related to him the last vision they had seen in the star, whereupon Herod's anxiety became almost too great for concealment. Menzer said that they had also seen a virgin with a child lying before her. From the right side of the child issued a branch formed of light, upon which stood a tower with many gates, which tower increased in size until it became a city. The child appeared standing above it with a sword and a scepter, and they had seen it not only themselves, but all the kings of the earth coming to bow down before and adore that child, for its kingdom was to vanquish all other kingdoms. Herod advised them to go quietly and without delay to Bethlehem, and when they had found the child, to return and inform him that he might go to and adore him. I saw the kings going down from the palace and leaving Jerusalem at once. The day was dawning, and the lights on the way leading up to the palace were still burning. The crowd that had followed the royal caravan had passed the night in the city. Herod, who, about the time of Christ's birth, had gone to his palace at Jericho, had even before the coming of the kings been very restless and uneasy. 2 of his illegitimate sons had been raised by him to high positions in the temple. They were Sadducees, and by them he was kept informed of all that had transpired, as well as of all who were opposed to his designs. Among these he was told of one, a man good and upright, a distinguished functionary of the temple. Herod sent him a courteous and friendly invitation to come to him in Jericho. When the good man was on his way to comply with the invitation, Herod's creatures fell upon him and murdered him in the desert. making it appear as if robbers had perpetrated the awful deed. Some days later, Herod returned to Jerusalem in order to take part in the feast of the consecration of the temple. Then he thought he would, in his own way, give pleasure to the Jews and show them honor. He caused to be made a golden figure, something like a lamb, though still more like a goat, for it had horns. This figure was to be erected above the gate leading from the outer court of the women into the court of sacrifice. Herod insisted upon this and, moreover, expected to be thanked for what he had done, but the priests resisted. Herod threatened them with a fine. They replied that the fine indeed they would pay, but that the figure, according to their law, they could never accept. Herod fell into a rage and ordered it to be set up secretly. Thereupon, one of the officers of the temple, fired with zeal, seized it as it was being brought in, cleft it in twain, and hurled it to the ground. This gave rise to a tumult, and Herod ordered the offender to be imprisoned. Herod was, on account of this affair, extremely displeased and regretted having come to the feast, but his courtiers sought by all kinds of diversions to remove the impression from his mind. There was among some pious people in Judea the expectation of the near advent of the Messiah, and the circumstances attendant on the birth of Jesus had been noised abroad by the shepherds. Herod had heard all and had at Bethlehem made secret inquiries into it. His spies, however, having found only poor Joseph, and having besides orders not to attract attention, reported that it was nothing, that they had found only a poor family buried in a cave, and that the whole affair was not worth talking about. But now all of a sudden appeared the great caravan of the kings. Their questioning after the king of Judah was marked by such confidence and precision. They spoke with such certainty of the star that Herod could scarcely hide his anxious perplexity. He hoped to learn the particulars of the affair from the kings themselves, and then take measures accordingly. But when the kings, warned by God, did not return, he explained their flight as a consequence of their falsehood and disappointment. They were, he thought, ashamed to come back and be looked upon as fools. He therefore caused to be proclaimed in Bethlehem and in a general way that the people should have nothing to do with the strangers. When he thought to make away with Jesus, he found that he was no longer in Nazareth. He caused search to be made after him for a long time. When he had to give up all hope of finding him, and his anxiety was in consequence so much the more increased, he took the desperate resolution to murder all the children. He was so cautious in executing his measures that he transported his troops beforehand in order to avoid any insurrection. End of reading. All right, notes. I didn't think I'd have much, but I have quite a few. Anyways, first note, if you've been around for all the readings, the lineage of the kings may have had to do with Tubal, who is the tribe of one of the sons of Japhet. Tubal, who was in the Caucasus Mountains as well. However, Anne Catherine said that they were the lineage of Job, and we know that Job is of the tribe of Shem rather than Japhet. Perhaps, though, that the Shem and Japhet had mixed together, and that's where the lineage of the kings was. Next note, I'll bring up again the mystery of the Black Sea. Anne Catherine said that before the fall, the Black Sea was above ground, and before the flood, that it was above ground and that there were fallen angels there, that they hadn't fallen all the way. They were like the quote-unquote middle plateau angels. They had created the Nephilim, or the sons of giants, the giants, which were big men who were possessed. And when she described their possession, it sounded a lot like demonic possession. The Byzantine Empire was around the Black Sea, and I've always known it as a region where there were a lot of You'd say Christians are the presence of Christ, but the region was never quite Catholic. The countries Turkey, Georgia, Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Romania, heavy in the Orthodox department. And Turkey is obviously Islam, the seat of the second great caliphate kind of thing. And they were chiefly, yeah, as I said, Orthodox. Not Turkey, obviously, but there's still a lot of Orthodox Christians in Turkey. There's some Catholics in these countries, but it's not like their dominant religion. So it makes me wonder, what's the big obstacle there? What is wrong with the Black Sea? Why is there something still there? Why is it an area of perennial conflict? Does it still represent a gateway to the underworld, especially Turkey? Next note. So we learn that there's a right way to look at the stars and a wrong way to do it. Horoscopes are the wrong way to do it. Genesis 1 affirms that the stars are to be used for signs and seasons. We have a calendar because of the movements in the heavens, after all. So, and look how we measure our year. The sun goes around the constellations once. Look at how we measure our months. It's the moon. And we can divide the moon's periods approximately in the 4 periods of 7, which are weeks. So that's where we got our calendar. Next note. One sows, another reap. Quotation, John 4. One sows, another reaps. We see that the angels work in those tribes to prepare them for the coming of the Messiah. Whether they receive it or not is another thing altogether, but it reminds me of Our Lady of Guadalupe. It's like a testament to that. You don't get 9 million baptisms in 10 years if there wasn't already something to be sown there. The angels had sown into the Aztec people the coming of the Messiah, and it was given through the Virgin, especially that image. The Aztecs were implicitly prepared for the Messiah. Otherwise, the wave of conversions wouldn't have been there. Basically, Our Lady saw a land that was ripe for the reaping. Next note. The star twinkled over the good towns and villages, but dimmed over the bad ones. Notice that in Jerusalem it wasn't visible at all. This suggests that though Jerusalem was so close, the closest city to Bethlehem, it was basically completely devoured by the devil. The devil had already established a powerful foothold there, and the king was nuts. Next note, the kings arriving in Jerusalem, it's like they were going to a party and they expected everybody to be celebrating, and you think, oh, hey, the redemption is coming, and they arrive in Jerusalem, and the people in Jerusalem is like, get a load of these guys. They think there's a party. Like, if there is one, I guess my invitation got lost in the mail, right? Then the whole city stirs and is like, wait a minute. Is there supposed to be a party? What are we missing here? There was a clear disconnect, and it was awkward on both sides, right? The kings were fairly convinced something significant had happened, and Jerusalem was fairly convinced that nothing at all happened. Last note, the idol that Herod had put together that he was trying to get set up in the temple, it reminded me a lot of Revelation 13:11. The quote is, "And I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon." Now, lamb versus dragon. Lamb is virtue, sacrifice. Dragon is power, rule, dominance. So, Herod puts this idol, and he's like, thank me, thank me. And they're like, no. And Herod got all mad, and he had one of their high officials killed, their benevolent ones, in a very cowardly way, a very kingly way, I should say. So it reminds me that he's like a figure of the Antichrist, Herod the Great, because when the king came around, he didn't rejoice. He had anxiety and fear. Remember that she said openly a few times in the text that the good people who received the news of the Messiah wanted to go visit him in Fawn. Well, the bad people, they were anxious and fearful, like something terrible had happened in the world. Those were the ones closer to the demons, like, oh no, something's here that's going to disrupt us. So we can assert we already knew this, but Herod is basically the first. He's not the first Antichrist figure, but he was prominent at the birth of Christ. There were a lot of Antichrist figures, and we think of Antiochus IV, right? He was a major one. But we see a lot of the sons of perdition and the men of iniquity. We're going to see in our times a Herod-like figure who will get anxious when the world gets more religious, when people get closer to God, when people go to a very reverent mass. The people that hate the reverent masses, you wonder, is it because there's a demon stirring in them? And that's the real question. Anyways, that's it. Ave Maria.